Hey, welcome back to E-commerce on Tap, brought to you by Sourcify and ISBA. I'm your host, Nathan Resnick, joined by my co-host, Aaron Alpeter. Aaron, for those that are joining us for the first time here, do you want to give a quick overview of what we do on E-commerce on Tap?
Yeah, we're so glad you joined us, first of all. But each episode, Nathan and I take a well-known, usually D2C started company. We tell their founding story, reverse engineer their supply chain, and talk about their X potential. And this season, we're focused on fragrance.
Yeah, and to be honest, I didn't know much about fragrance before diving into this. Last episode, we did this incredible overview of the whole industry, where growth areas are, supply chain, and more. It's definitely worth checking out if you want to get kind of a high-level overview of the fragrance category as a whole and where there's opportunities. Today, we're diving into Phlur, which is, I think one of the fastest-growing D2C brands in the fragrance industry. But before we dive in, any tidbits that caught your eye the past week?
This one was pretty interesting, and it was that the Honest Company is shutting down its D2C site about 15 years after it launched. And so, this is the Honest Company. This is one of the OG D2C companies. And so the fact that they looked at this and said, you know what, we're not shutting down. We're actually still doing well. We're going to lean into retail, but you will no longer be able to order products from our website, I thought was really interesting. And I did a deep dive on this a few weeks ago, and El Catterton had purchased a majority stake a few years ago. And the mandate that they had basically given the new management team was around profitability. And when you look at all the CACs that are increasing, the shipping, the fulfillment costs, really the most profitable thing for them to do was to commit wholly to retail. And so I just think this is a really fascinating case study, because there's this reality that eventually you've got to have good unit economics. And there are some D2C companies that have really high margins. We'll talk about a couple of them today that can persist in D2C for a long time. But if you're trying to sell diapers and wipes and other consumables and you're competing with low cost providers in Costco or Walmart, it's really difficult to have a viable D2C business.
Yeah, I mean, that's fascinating, right? I feel like D2C used to be the go-to playbook, and now you have kind of one of the largest D2C brands saying, hey, we're actually shutting down our D2C site and just going full force on distribution through, our partner retailers across the nation.
Yeah, it's pretty wild. What about you? What caught your eye?
Yeah, for me, I don't know if you've drinking kind of that Laird Hamilton or Laird type of coffee creamer before, but there's another brand that I drink sometimes called Navitas Organics that has this like cow powder that's pretty good, and they've got a bunch of other different kind of organic type of supplements. And so Laird just announced a $38.5 million cash acquisition of Navitas Organic, and that was funded by a $50 million preferred note capital management. So I think it's pretty neat because Laird was doing about 43 million in revenue. Navitas was about 36 million in revenue. So combined, they're around 80. And I think it's kind of this dynamic of, Laird's gotten to a certain scale that they now need to kind of attach on acquisitions to kind of further fuel their growth and their kind of category here. And so I think it makes a lot of sense to give Laird, instant scale, broader functional description of the platform, right? I mean, consumer products, and kind of this shift from a subscale brand to more of a sponsored platform.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Would you consume those products together, or were they for different occasions in your own life?
Usually different occasions, but at times I can see people, having them together for sure. So I think it kind of positions Laird as more of a platform player here, almost how like Aries, expand in other categories in a sense, add on acquisitions. I think very similar playbook.
Interesting. I hope it works out for him.
We will see. Well, diving into Phlur here, I think it's pretty neat because this is different than how we think of fragrance as a whole, right? For more than a century, fragrance followed a pretty clear script here, right? It was authority over emotion, aspiration over intimacy, counters, not culture, and for a long time that worked. So when we sat down to plan this season, the obvious place to start would have been a legacy house, maybe Chanel, right? Maybe a brand that defined what fragrance was supposed to be. But instead, we're actually starting to Phlur, not because it's the oldest, not because it's the biggest, but because it shows us when fragrance finally broke away from its old roots. Phlur wasn't a broken brand. It was a perfectly fine one, clean, credible, well made, doing what fragrance brand had done for years. And then almost overnight, something changed. One product reframed how people talk about scent. TikTok replaced department store counter. Emotion replaced authority. In a category that many people thought had been fully figured out, suddenly felt new again. This episode isn't just a story of a brand going viral. It's the story of a fragrance born for the modern consumer. And once you understand what happened here, you start to see the rest of the industry very differently.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you're listening, you made it this far, thank you so much. We please do us a favor and like and subscribe. It's super helpful. And we've had some really interesting conversations with people who've reached out. So why don't we dive in there? Like, who are they? What was their background? How did they end up with this business?
Yeah, so Phlur was founded in 2015 by Cynthia and Eric Corman. They're a husband and wife team based in Austin, Texas. Cynthia came from a brand and marketing background. She worked as an art director at places like Condé Nast. And Eric had experience in operations and entrepreneurship, having worked at Ralph Lauren as president of digital and global e-com. So they were not, industry insiders here, but they had similar thoughts as we did, that fragrance should do very well in B2C, but their core insight wasn't that fragrance was broken, right? It was that consumers had no idea what's in fragrance, and the lack of transparency feels incredibly out of step with where beauty is going. So this was at the time in the mid 2010s where skincare was being, quote unquote, decoded here. There was this clean beauty trend that was emerging as a category, and consumers were really questioning this legacy, just dynamic of not knowing what's going in their products, right? And so they felt that fragrance was the last black box that was out there, and their insight wasn't emotional. It was more around kind of ethics and rationale.
Yeah, as we talked about in the kickoff episode, clean fragrance is one of the hardest subcategories that you can look at, just given how dependent the industry is on synthetics. Why did they decide to start there with clean fragrance?
You're right. They didn't choose this because it was easy. They chose it because it was the only, really differentiated lane available at a D2C at the time. And fragrance was kind of this, they thought first mover advantage into D2C. And so you mentioned this aspirational luxury was really owned by the legacy houses like Chanel. And there was celebrity fragrances, but those were more retail driven with that sample strategy you mentioned. And, kind of niche perfumery was really insider only. And so clean and transparent was the only story that mapped to a D2C culture, felt modern, and gave consumers this reason to switch. And so, this was difficult, right? You ask perfumers to reformulate without certain synthetics, you're gonna, really look to it's a challenge, right? And looking to maintain the longevity and projection of the product with tighter ingredient constraints makes it extremely hard for someone to formulate this new, D2C approach. And so, to their credit, they worked with established fragrance houses, including Simrise, who's one of the largest global suppliers of fragrance compounds.
Wow. How long were they picking at this idea before they were able to launch it?
They said in multiple interviews that they had kind of tinkered with this a lot before actually jumping in. And I feel like many of us, face that, right? We've all got ideas in our head, when to jump in, right? And so they started really working on the idea here in 2013, 2014. And keep in mind that D2C infrastructure was really different back then, right? In the early 2010s, Shopify and Stripe were, coming to be. So they did a lot of work around the brand concept, the values, the formulation, and supplier education took time for them to understand what these clean constraints were, right? Because they were not, fragrance insiders here. They didn't know, hey, how do we formulate a clean fragrance brand? So when you think about clean fragrance, it actually dramatically narrows the ingredient choice. And so there's a lot more iteration, a lot more testing, more back and forth with suppliers. And so they didn't launch till mid 2015 after working on this for almost 2 years. And they launched with 6 fragrances, full size and travel variations on their website. And, early Phlur messaging was very explicit. They had ingredient transparency, IFRA compliance, which is kind of, industry standard, cruelty-free ingredient, and ethical sourcing. And so we don't have publicly shared revenue figures for the launch, but it was most likely that it was low single digit millions at most. So we estimate year two was probably between 2 to 5 million, which is still small by DTC standards, but respectable for this category. And year three was a little better, but not this hockey growth that we try to see.
Yeah, I mean, I'll take $5 million if people are handing it away, but 5 million doesn't really go very far when you're accounting for all the money that you're giving to Meta and Google, especially when you're trying to create a market here. So, why do you think they had such modest initial traction compared to years later that we'll get to?
Yeah, I mean, I think first and foremost, kind of Phlur 1.0 was selling values, not feelings. It kind of spoke the language of transparency, ethics, and ingredients, and it didn't really, lean into feelings. And so this worked well for skincare, but for fragrance, buyers weren't shopping for these answers. They were shopping for identity. And so that being said, Phlur spent its first 3 years proving fragrance could work in this DTC channel, and it just hadn't, proved that it could scale culturally. And so Cynthia and Eric built a very credible business, but it wasn't a breakout brand. And, it's estimated that they were doing, single digit or low teens in annual revenue, with, single digit or low double digit growth rates. And the brand was seen as this thoughtful, credible, well formulated, product, but it wasn't a must have culture defining fragrance, right? And so though they had real revenue, real customers, and real retail relationships, it still had a lot of challenges in terms of incumbents that had already had distribution, brand recognition. And so Instagram was visual first, which made it difficult for fragrance to translate. So they had to skew towards brand values, press features, and retailer support versus product, right? And so I think that kind of is what makes this a lot different than other B2C approaches, is that it was very hard to kind of showcase that emotion through just an Instagram post. So they did raise a Series A in 2019. This was led by Simrise's venture arm. It was reported in the $7 million range. And this capital was used to scale product development, expand operations, and acquire Texas Beauty Labs, which became their own manufacturing asset, which was later rebranded to Good Kind Co, actually.
Yeah, I've actually been to that factory when it was Texas Beauty Labs, and they're pretty well known in the clean beauty space. They were the factory that helped launch and scale native deodorant, if you know that team. And I actually forgot that they had been purchased and been rebranded. So I was at Beauty Connect a couple months ago and reconnected with the team at Good Kind, and they do all sorts of really interesting personal care stuff, not just fragrance. Why do you think they opted to purchase their manufacturing versus rely on a co-packer like so many other brands?
Yeah, it's a really good question, right? And we don't see this too much on e-commerce on tap, right? I think there's only been a few episodes that we've covered brands that actually acquired their manufacturing partner. So this was definitely a strategic move. And I think on the surface, it seems a little puzzling because fragrance, already has high margins. So why would you lean into this acquisition? And you'd think they were chasing margin improvement, but I think there was other ways to think about it. And probably kind of four main reasons here that I'll sum up. So number one, I think greater control over clean formulation constraints. So they could probably have a bit more, IP around the process and less supplier pushback because they controlled that process vertically. I think number two, they de-risk supply chain dependency. I think, by 2018, Phlur probably had learned that they weren't a huge priority for these large suppliers, and owning their own manufacturer, which was based in their hometown, resulted probably in fewer bottlenecks and probably faster development timelines. And third, it enabled them to expand beyond fragrance, right? And so while they had positioned initially as a fragrance brand, and their clean thesis could naturally extend into other categories like body care, hair, home, and other personal care. And so this gave them the optionality to test and expand into other products, I think, very readily. Last but not least, it changed the nature of a potential acquisition, right? And so by acquiring their supplier that was profitable and had more of a diverse client base, they opened themselves up to be, viewed here as an infrastructure play, having actual assets beyond just a brand. So I think if you're in a category that's growing quickly and you can acquire one of the main kind of leading sources for products in your industry, it makes sense strategically.
Yeah, I guess that's interesting. And they actually did end up selling in 2021. And so let's fast forward to 2020. And Eric and Cynthia have been at this for 5 years, full time and probably part time, more like 7 years. And I would imagine that there were some key questions that they were asking themselves. When you look at declining department store traffic, and they see that okay, this is under strain, where people mainly buy fragrances, you start to see that clean beauty has gone from a differentiator to becoming more table stakes. And that I thought that was very apparent in the companies that I was working with and advising, was that in 2018 it was like, oh, I'm clean, I'm very unique because of that. And come to 2020, 2021, it's like, well, everybody's clean, and so you got to be there. But you've got rising DC costs, and just really the brand, I think in its essence, hadn't really broken through culturally the way that they had hoped it was going to. And so naturally, any founder would ask themselves, do we want to keep iterating with the same model, or do we think that there's someone else who can take this further? And I think that relative to the broader fragrance market, Phlur sat in a very specific lane. It was more modern than the legacy houses that you would see, and it was more serious than some of the indie perfumers, but also more principled than some of the celebrity brands. And they kind of had differentiated themselves successfully, but at the same time were a little bit boxed in by that positioning. And it didn't quite feel luxury. It didn't have that emotional storytelling or personal identity that you would get with a celebrity brand. But it did make sense given their thesis that they would eventually expand into other fragrances and things like that. So they started adding different formats and travel and discovery sets, and they really doubled down on transparency and ingredient storytelling. And they intentionally stayed disciplined in the sense that they weren't going to go after and trace trends. And so, this isn't a brand that tried to partner with celebrities or flood the market with a lot of flanker scents or things like that. They really just tried to stick with what they were doing. And I think the thesis was slow and steady wins the race.
Yeah, I mean, at this point, they had the optionality, right, to continue what they're doing or look for an acquisition. I mean, what do you think acquirers were really evaluating at this time?
Yeah, I think after 5 years of operation, an acquirer would look at Phlur and say they have been de-risked operationally, right? They're under leveraged creatively, and it's priced like a steady business versus a hyped asset. So you're going to get some multiple of cash flow as opposed to a multiple of revenue. And it's actually these exact reasons that made them attractive to their ultimate acquirer, which was a company called The Center. And I actually didn't know The Center. I knew the brands, but I went to take a look at it as we were preparing. And it is a beauty brand holding company founded by Ben Bennett, who basically has the thesis, and he built the company to do one thing very, very well. And it was to acquire or incubate under leveraged beauty brands and then rebuild them around modern creative community or distribution engines. And so it's an operator-led platform that sits somewhere between a brand studio and somewhere between a creative agency and somewhere between a holding company. The center takes control and runs the brands as opposed to just advising them. And so this is what was attractive, and they thought that there was a lot of meat on the bone with Phlur, and they wanted to do some things differently. So they were going through their diligence, and they were saying, okay, does this brand have real product quality? Yes, it does. Do they have operational credibility? Yes, they do. Is there category legitimacy? Yes, fragrance have been in for a long time. And then, do they have good profitable revenue, but they're just missing something? And they felt that was exactly what they were buying. And so the timing seemed to be good enough for Eric and Cynthia. And, they're in the backdrop of COVID. D2C is accelerating. You're not sure how long this is going to continue, meaning the D2C boom. And so they end up selling Phlur to The Center while retaining the factory, which they've rebranded to Good Kind, as we talked about.
Yeah, I mean, what was it about Phlur that you think encouraged The Center to make this deal? I mean, these guys had been at it for, the better part of 7 years. Why do you think kind of The Center thought they could bend the trajectory of this brand, right? I mean, oftentimes you don't see brands that are kind of getting that second win 7 years in. I mean, it does happen, but very rarely is it kind of, okay, we've been at this for 7 years, kind of compounding at our own pace. Now let's try to, invest and hit that hockey stick growth, right?
You're right. I mean, I think every acquirer is like, oh, naturally, like I can make this better, but it doesn't quite end up that way. I think the Center saw this as a category bet, not a one brand bet. And so they were basically making a bet that they thought that fragrance's time was next, and that TikTok was actually going to become the discovery engine that the e-commerce world had been waiting for. And so with TikTok and their expertise there, they thought that their ability to do emotional storytelling would outperform any sort of content around ingredient transparency. And in hindsight, I mean, the timing was pretty perfect as well. By 2021, TikTok was ready but not saturated, and fragrance was underrepresented on the platform. Consumers were really primed for emotional products post-pandemic. And so after the acquisition, they brought in someone by the name of Chriselle Lim, who became the public creative force behind Phlur. For those of you who don't know Chriselle, she's a digital entrepreneur, a fashion influencer, and a founder in her own right. She's considered one of the OG fashion and style influencers, and a lot of her content focuses on fashion, beauty, especially K-beauty, as well as motherhood. And she had co-founded an educational childcare company called Boomo, and Sync Studios was a creative studio that for fashion and beauty brands. So she was really well known in this space. And I think it's important that when the center brought in Chriselle, it wasn't to have her be a celebrity that was endorsing it. It was an operator-creator hybrid model. And they felt that Phlur didn't need a better formulation or better ethics or even a better supply chain. What they needed was a new interpretive lens. And Chriselle brought this taste authority, this cultural fluency, and a built-in audience and emotional storytelling instincts that really, became the benefit for it. And so she deeply understood how modern consumers were narrating identity, how TikTok content actually travels, and how emotion can beat authority and discovery when it comes to TikTok. And I think that she didn't start by asking, how do we explain fragrance better? She really went more fundamental from that and said, why do people actually buy fragrance today? And I think it was important because, she made the distinction that she wasn't selling Phlur, she was going to live inside it. And this framing was completely different to anything that had happened out there before.
Yeah, I mean, I think we should double click here, right? Because Chriselle, is this kind of influencer creator that has millions of followers across, Instagram and TikTok. And, you've kind of seen this playbook many times, especially during this period of, hey, let's, get this large influencer creator with a big following and partner them and pair them up with a brand that has some strong foundation. A lot of times you don't see it work, but here you see it really work. And so I think it's kind of crucial to double click and dive into kind of some of the important things that she identified.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, the biggest thing that she recognized was that fragrance needed a new job. And as we talked about prior to 2021, fragrance was expected to signal status, sophistication, and it was like an outward projection. And that's why it required authority and aspirational imagery and expert validation. But she realized that the new job that fragrance could have would be to trigger a memory, to help you regulate your own mood and to ink our identity and help feel intimate. And so the old model was hostile and not compatible with TikTok, while the new model was perfect for TikTok. And so you started to see things shift quietly, then suddenly all at once at the brand, where they went from education to permission. And so Phlur 1.0 would talk about ingredients and they would justify the cleanliness and improve credibility, kind of explain why they should be caring about what they're putting on their bodies. Phlur 2.0 gave permission to feel something. It validated their emotional experience. It helped remove the need to understand why it was the way it was. And so they kind of switched the narrative from rational proof to emotional truth. And instead of talking about top, middle, and base notes and using all this perfumery language, they started to center their narratives on memories, relationships, absence, closeness. And this insight and this testing culminated in a new scent that they launched called Missing Person. And the core idea was, this smells like someone you miss. There weren't any prestige cues. There wasn't any expertise needed. There was no aspirational ladder. It was just a universal human feeling. Everybody misses somebody. And they gave people the ability to test this emotional claim, and everybody can talk about someone that they miss without having this expertise. And this is just the opposite of what traditional fragrance is. By making this change, they solved a couple structural problems that had prevented fragrance from doing well in the past. The first one was that you could do discovery without smelling, because you don't need to know what it smells like. You need to know what it feels like, right? And because everybody has missed somebody in their life, this really translates well to peer-to-peer conversations on TikTok. And so creators could explain it in their own words without needing a strict script. And it wasn't really like a warm feeling or a sensual feeling. People were being very specific in their emotions and kind of this relationship they had, this person that they were missing. And in this precise level of narrative made it so authentic, and it made it so easy for people to share that it just kind of blew up overnight because people were tapping into something that they already want to talk about, and missing person happened to be the excuse that they could have to have that conversation.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's impossible to understate how big of an impact this had on Phlur, and the fragrance industry as a whole, right? I mean, we've seen this before in terms of a DTC brand has many SKUs and then they kind of launch this breakout SKU. And I feel like Missing Person is that SKU for Phlur, right? Because prior to Missing Person, Phlur had a lot of SKUs, but none had really kind of reframed the category. And so after this launch, it had this gravitational center and everything else kind of orbited around it. And it kind of became their Rosetta Stone for the brand, kind of the new entry point for new consumers and a culture shorthand. And once that existed, the rest of the portfolio made sense, right? So, I mean, we'll see if this is an overstatement now, but I think in maybe 10 to 15 years, we'll recognize Missing Person as kind of the Chanel #5 moment for the 21st century, but in a different way. And if you think about how Chanel #5 standardized the aspiration, fragrance kind of equals this elegance and authority. In the 21st century, you kind of compare that and say Missing Person has legitimatized intimacy in terms of fragrance equals memory plus self-connection, right? And so I think both of these help reset what fragrance was for. And, one was outward looking, one was inward looking. I think the inward looking, aligns with this decade, right? And so I think we'll kind of see this as a huge shift for the entire industry that I think really, put Phlur more on the map.
I think you are completely 100% spot on. And when you frame it like that, it's a huge change with a huge impact. And I like, talk us through, how did this change in messaging and redefining what fragrance could be, how did it actually show up in TikTok, and how did it go viral?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's really interesting is that, it happened with influencers, but not in the traditional sense, right? So instead, what happened is that creators would smell this and they would react emotionally. They'd try to kind of articulate what they felt emotionally. And I think that would kind of signal and invite their comments to help interpret things. And so this is kind of that dynamic that we discussed earlier in the episode in terms of like, how do you actually portray scent in a video or photo through social? And before this, Phlur, kind of had failed at that in terms of articulating what scent actually felt like, right? And so this was a huge shift in their product line, and kind of enabled them to engage their consumers, their customers, with more social proof validation loops, and kind of really made it something that you experienced and talked about versus something that you had to experience in a department store through sampling. So as you can imagine, the shift from being credible to being category defining changes everything for Phlur. And the business changes really in three deliberate ways, right? So number one, DTC becomes the engine, not just the channel. Number two, retail becomes the amplifier, not the discovery layer. And number three, the brand, reorganizes around a hero product and not a portfolio, right? And I kind of want to double click on the third point here, because if you think about it, most major DTC brands that we know today, they do have a hero SKU, right? And I think when Phlur launched, maybe the portfolio was a bit too broad, right? They didn't have this kind of standalone product until Missing Person. And I think that's something that every DTC operator or founder think about in terms of like, what is your hero SKU? What are you really investing in there? Because if you go broad too early, maybe you're missing that deep connection with consumers that can kind of help you hit that growth, right? And so post 2021, Phlur D2C business fundamentally, changes shape, right? Um, Prior to the acquisition, it had been steady, but really unspectacular, very education heavy, low frequency. And afterward, there were kind of these viral demand spikes, wait lists, sellouts, and kind of high first time conversion. That was much different, prior to acquisition. So Missing Person, I think, likely drove a step in in site traffic. I mean, see the virality. If you look back on their social media page, it definitely has served first-time buyers, which is key for any D2C brand. Think about it. How do you get those first-time buyers, and then some of them are convert into loyal customers, right? And so this also flipped their CAC dynamics, and organic TikTok definitely replaced a lot of their paid acquisition, and creators here were able to do that educational component. So in 2022, after their viral breakout, Phlur expanded to Sephora, which you can imagine was just huge distribution for them, and really kind of put their brand more on the map. And I think this is really interesting as well, because retail for the first time was no longer responsible just for discovery. It was that customers were arriving at Sephora already having been educated about Phlur and their missing person product, and going into these retail shelves and becoming a great sales channel for the brand. So it was more of a credibility signal, a volume multiplier, not a brand building channel here.
Yeah, I think that this reframing of retail is really insightful. And I feel like whenever things are going super well for anybody, there's always this tendency to overextend and do more things because you want the growth to increase. What did they do operationally with all of this viral growth?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think one thing that I admired is that, when you have win in your sales, oftentimes, you've got to understand how do I keep my sales full, right? How do I keep going in this direction, right? And so they were very thoughtful on what they did and what they didn't do, right? And so first, they remained very disciplined with their product portfolio. They didn't flood the market with a ton of different lines here. They kept the missing person at kind of their gravitational center, and other launches that they did were very adjacent to that. And they continued to educate and train customers in terms of how they thought about scent. Secondly, they were very selective about the adjacent categories they entered into. So they leaned into body fragrances, layering formats that increased usage frequency, but they didn't dilute, into unrelated personal care categories or chase kind of, micro TikTok trends here. I think that really, preserved the coherence of the brand. Last but not least, I would say they really focused on scaling their team and just became more disciplined when it comes to their organization, right? So they built kind of key teams and hired around creative social media ops that could kind of handle these spikes in sales and virality.
Yeah, the more and more that we talk about this, the more impressed and convinced I am that this was the watershed moment in the 21st century in fragrance. And I mean, like, the fuse that was lit changed everything, and not only for Phlur, but every other brand that would be in fragrance kind of adopted this mindset to talk to this generation of consumers. And when you look at kind of the size of the business, I mean, we don't have any exact figures that have been disclosed. It was announced in 2024 that Phlur was going to be acquired by TSG, which is a very large PE fund. And I think it's safe to assume that the brand was doing north of $100 million, or at least clearly on the path of doing so, with a high double-digit growth rate and profitability and things like that. Just by virtue of the fact that TSG doesn't buy small brands, they buy at multiples that require scale and durability. And so this was clearly no longer a $10 to $12 million brand. This was a major player. With the deal, TSG acquired a majority stake and Scented retained a meaningful minority. But most importantly is Christelle Lynn continued as the creative force behind Phlur.
Yeah, I mean, assuming Phlur is a $100 million fragrance brand, I think it's really interesting to kind of compare the shape of their business versus the other $100+ million brands that we've covered before. I mean, what did legacy $100 million brands look like?
For a $100 million brand, roughly 70 to 90% of their volume would have come from a department store or duty free. And there would have been a heavy reliance on gifting promotions and staff behind the counter. So training those folks. Brand typically had 1 to 2 hero SKUs, a long tail of flankers, and very long, very slow innovation cycles. Consumers would typically skew a little bit older, and they would be anchored to a signature scent, and they wouldn't be really willing to try new things or to be online. And in theory, the margins would be very high on paper, but they'd be compressed by retail markups, allowances, slotting, promotional spend, all those sorts of things. If you look at Jo Malone, which is a good comp, in its early years, it was retail-led and gift-heavy, and it had a very large prestige positioning, and its growth depended on new geographies and more doors. And even though the brand was very valuable, the growth was linear. And if you look at Elizabeth Ardeen, which was a celebrity scent at $100 million, it had a fast initial ramps, high marketing spend, was very volatile, and a relatively short life cycle. So a celebrity brand could hit $100 million quickly, but then struggle to stay there.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. I mean, different do you think Phlur is to the traditional nine-figure fragrance brand here, right? I mean, I think we should double click a little bit there.
Yeah, it's completely different. Like it's an inverted channel matrix that the industry had ever seen before. So Phlur, first and foremost, is D2C led instead of retail led. That's something that you mentioned. And it was socially discovered instead of media discovered. And it was retail amplified instead of D2C amplified. And so this fundamentally changes everything about their data, about their margin control, about the speed of the business. And they have a direct consumer relationship. They know who bought, why they bought it, what content converted them, what they bought next. And legacy players just don't know that. They know where it was sold, and that's about it. Phlur's usage behavior is also very, very different. So legacy brands are based off of an occasion, a signature scent logic, and just long replenishment cycles. Phlur is really focused on layering in culture and mood and base usage. And as a result, it has much higher purchase frequency and it has a much higher cultural relevance as well. And these legacy brands rely on heritage and just Marilyn Monroe, like going back to that aesthetic. And Phlur is for the here and now. It's got this cultural relevancy, this fluency that's just very difficult to replicate. So in many ways, a $100 million fragrance brand in 2005 would have been near maturity and playing more defense and optimizing for cash flow compared to a $100 million fragrance brand today, where Phlur is relatively early in its global life cycle. It's still expanding its usage occasions and it's still building its community. And so there's really no indication that this is at the end of its life cycle. If anything, it's at the beginning of its life cycle.
Yeah, I mean, Phlur kind of shows us that fragrance didn't need, kind of new molecules or better margins to grow. It really needed, a better way to be understood, right? And so I think once fragrance moved from authority to emotion, from, counters to culture, and from aspiration to intimacy, the category didn't just grow, it really changed, right? So every brand we talk about this season is responding to that shift, whether they realize it or not. I mean, what were the biggest standouts for you here?
I think there were two. First one was that fragrance didn't suddenly work. It was just waiting for a new translator, which Cristal was. It didn't invent demand for fragrance. What Phlur was able to do was change how fragrance was explained. And for decades, fragrance really relied on this authority, this aspiration, these institutions, and it worked in department stores, but it failed online. And Phlur showed us that once fragrance is translated into an emotion and a narrative, the category unlocks, not just in a small way, but really at scale. And TikTok didn't create the trend. It removed a bottleneck that had existed. So that's the big takeaway for me. The second one is that clean and ethical, well-made are table stakes. They're not growth drivers for a brand. And early Phlur did absolutely everything right. They had a clean formulation, transparency, strong suppliers, vertical integration, et cetera, et cetera. But that brand still plateaued at that period of time. And the lesson isn't that those things don't matter. It's that they just don't pull new consumers in on their own the way that they did maybe 10 years ago. They are prerequisites. There's something that everybody has to have, and really emotion and the emotion that you feel when using the product is a differentiator. What about you?
Yeah, I mean, those are great points. I mean, I think for me, I was just surprised and admired how the reboot here really mattered more than the founding, right? I mean, if you think about it, most consumer stories kind of over-index on the founding, and Phlur is kind of the opposite here, right? I mean, the founders built a credible platform, but the breakout, really only happened after a new operator took over and the narrative was redefined by a thought leader that, knew how to reframe kind of the culture dynamic here. I think also, D2C fragrance works when D2C is the engine, not the whole business, right? So, they didn't win by choosing D2C instead of retail. They won by, really kind of using D2C to create demand and social to educate. And last but not least, I thought that, missing person, that kind of key product that they launched, reframed what fragrance is for. And historically, fragrance was about, projection and signaling. and missing person kind of made it more about, memory and an inward experience. So I think, just this story here of Phlur really kind of shifted my mindset in terms of, hey, there can be kind of this second founding or second storytelling around a brand. It doesn't have to be just founder story, and how key it is to use social to educate your audience.
Absolutely. So this was a really interesting story and a really interesting company. I think it sets up this season of e-commerce on tap really well, because this is kind of the beginning of modern fragrance, and it is the fundamental shift change that all of the other brands that we'll talk about will be paying homage to some extent, because they changed what it means, and it's the reason why the category is exploding the way that it is today.
100%. And for those that are tuning in, please like, subscribe, share, leave a review. Aaron and I appreciate you listening to E-Commerce on Tap, brought to you by Source Fine ISBA. We will see you next time.